Assalamu alaikum. Greetings for a good day and for a good life. Hope you people are doing good, you are safe, taking very good care of yourself and everybody close to you and near you as much as you can with a distance of 6 feet. Today we'll talk about the progressivism in America, which is almost an era of reform. So sometimes it is also called the age of reform. In your lecture plan, the readings are under the name of the age of reform. How this progressivism got initiated and what were its roots? One of the reasons was the fight against corruption and inefficiency in government, and the continuing power of corrupt big city political machines and the growing influence of large corporations. This really outraged the basic concerns of the citizens of America. And it has also roots in the efforts to regulate and control big business. As you must have noticed in the last lecture, that the big business really came like a thunder and spread like a storm. Giant corporations' threat the threat was not so much the economic well-being as the ambition and sense of importance of the middle class. The growth of large labor organizations worried such types, individual relationships excuse me, between employer and worker no longer counted for much. In general, human character and moral values seemed less influential, cold, impersonal, heartless were the big organizations of the business, and these people had basically the control of the society. And then there came the journalists. They are known as muckrakers. These journalists suddenly brought the movement into focus, the movement of progressive thinking. For many years, magazines had been publishing articles. They were discussing political, social, and economic problems. The tempo and fearfulness of the type of literature steadily increased. But something was radically wrong with the American character. McClure wrote, he was an editor, S.S. McClure, and he decided to include in the January 1903 issue an attack on labor gangsterism in the coal fields along with installments. Now you are familiar with this idea. When people are in a way challenged or threatened, they go into being a gangster and into all the gang techniques. With McClure, another editor joined him for writing those articles that if we do not stop it, we have to pay in the end. And this editorial loosed a chain reaction. Theodore Roosevelt, with his gift for vivid language, compared these journalists to the man with the muckrake. In Puritan writer John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, he writes that he could not notice the celestial crown that was offered him in exchange. So we have to understand the progressive mind. Progressives were essentially middle-class moralists seeking to arouse the conscience of the people in order to purify American life, purify of all those things that they considered was not ethical or moral. Therefore, the solution to social problem in changing faulty institutions. And despite this fervor and all siding with democracy, progressivism was paternalistic, moderate, and often soft-handed. And the groups against it were not open and were not soft-headed. But the reformers typically oversimplified complicated issues and treated their personal values as absolute standards of truth and morality, which is not true. It has to be a universally accepted thing. And we must emphasize that the progressives never challenged the fundamental principles of capitalism, nor did they attempt a basic reorganization of the society. And you know, in capitalist economy, few get the power, and they are then the people who decide for the destiny of the rest of the society. But the progressives' concern was not present at that time. Their concern was future. And they were writing about it, and seriously writing about it. And then comes Freud. Freud's psychoanalytical theories attracted numbers of Americans, especially after Freud lectured at Clark University in 1909. So some saw in Freud's ideas reason to effect a revolution of manners and morals that would have shocked or at least embarrassed Freud, who was personally quite conventional. So most larger cities boasted groups of these Bohemian thinkers. Why were they called Bohemian thinkers? Because they were thinking out of the box. The creative writers of the era, applying the spirit of progressivism to the realism they had inherited from Howells, the president, and the naturalists, tended to adopt an optimistic tone. The famous Ezra Pound talked grandly of an American Renaissance and fashioned a new kind of poetry called imagism, which, while not appearing to be realistic, abjured all abstract generalizations. Most progressive writers took Freud's technique to mean that they should cast off the restrictions. And this was like an innocent rebellion. First thing under these reformist agenda came that the cities should be reformed first. And to an ordinary progressive, political corruption and inefficiency by at large lay at the roots of the evil plaguing American cities. This sounds familiar. Similar condition existed in other communities. For his famous muckraking series for Monclure, Lincoln Stephens visited St. Louis, Minneapolis, Pittsburgh, New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, and found them all riddled with corruption. So a society is eaten up by the termite of corruption, and a reform has to be thought, minds have to be changed, and that is one way to implement it. City reformers could seldom destroy the machine without changing urban political institutions. So they thought of political reform, and they started with the states. To carry out this kind of a change required the support of state legislatures, because all municipal government dependent on the authority of a sovereign state. And this is always like a universal rule. During first decade of a new century, Wisconsin, the progressive state par excellence, was transformed by Robert Amla Follett, one of the most remarkable figures of the age. While Governor La Follett overhauled the political structure of the state, over the opposition of railroad and lumbering interests, he obtained a direct primary system for nominating candidates. The success of such policies, which became known as the Wisconsin idea, led other states to adopt similar programs. And reform administration swept into office in Iowa and Kansas, Oregon, Minnesota, Kansas and Mississippi, New York and Georgia, Nebraska and New Jersey and Colorado. A great number of states joined it. And they took the responsibility of completing the agenda of social legislation. And following this trend, and some states established special rules for workers in hazardous industries, which today are known as labor laws in many countries. The progressives continued to battle for legislation based on the coercive powers of the state. Women played a particularly important part in these struggles because many states were limiting the hours of older children to 8 or 10% per day and outlawed night work and labor in dangerous occupation by minors was halted. By 1917, all the states had placed limitation on the hours for women industrial workers, and the 10 states had minimum wage standard for women. So these were the laws protecting workers against the on-job accidents were enacted. So by passage of so much state social legislation sent conservative to the Supreme Court. They were not ready for all this in a way revolutionary legislation, and they wanted a redress. Such persons believed quite sincerely in most instances that no government had the power to deprive either worker or employer of the right to negotiate any kind of labor contract as they wished. The non-legal evidence impressed the justice. Not one justice, justices. After 1908, the right of states to protect the weaker member of society by special legislation was widely accepted. So progressive also launched a massive, if ill-coordinated, attack on problems related to monopoly. We have talked about monopoly when we were talking about the big business. But most importantly, in political reforms came the women's suffrage, the women's right to vote. And progressive era saw the culmination of struggle for voting rights for women. But it resulted in a split among feminists. One group, the American Women's Suffrage Association, focused on the vote question alone. The more radical National Women's Suffrage Association, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, two big names in American history, concerned itself with many issues of importance to women as well as the suffrage. So they basically enlarged the circle of women interest. These ideas and in a way prejudices enticed feminists into a local logical trap. If women were morally superior to men, in a very tempting conclusion, giving men the suffrage would improve the character of the electorate. The trouble with this kind of arguments always is that they could opponent could easily demonstrate that in states where women did vote, governments were no longer in a situation to the principles of equality. Political reform came and the income taxes and popular election of senators was introduced. Then came Roosevelt, and Roosevelt is known to be a threat to the conservatives, and it had its reasons. He did not fit their conception based on a composite image of the chief executive from Hayes to McKinley of what a president should like. To them, he appeared too undignified, too energetic, too outspoken. Above all, Roosevelt believed in action, and his action brought many acts and laws that created a Department of Commerce and Labor, which was to include a Bureau of Corporation with authority to investigate industrial combines and issue reports.